Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our SoCal APWA July webinar. We'll be starting at 12:05, so that would allow other users to go ahead and log in and get situated. While we wait, we have our 2020 annual sponsors that's going to be looped in the background, so please feel free to check them out, and we will see you guys at 12:05. Thank you. All right, so welcome everyone. I am Tran. I'm your chapter president for the Southern California APWA chapter. I want to welcome all of you, from our valued members to our prospective members. From the board of directors and myself, we thank you for participating in today's webinar. We're exceeding our expectations as we have gone through several months of online webinars, and we hope you appreciate the programming. That is a huge thanks to one of our program chair, which is Natasha Dominion, and she's a panelist today too. So we appreciate her efforts. This webinar is a little bit different. We have partnered with ACEC. Some of you who are APWA members may not know what ACEC is. ACEC is American Council of Engineering Companies. ACEC is in California as well, and has a local LA chapter. It's an association that represents over 1,000 engineering and land surveying firms throughout the state, and is known for their valuable networking opportunities and legislative leadership they offer for their members. For more than over 60 years, ACEC has been effective in advocating for infrastructure funding for the public good and seeking regulatory enhancements for the betterment of the industry. ACEC always seeks to partner in coalition with great organizations like us, APWA, and is happy to be able to help educate folks on important topics like today's topic, which is qualification-based selection processes. The organization is committed to advancing the private practice of consulting engineering, enhancing markets for private engineering services, educating the public on the importance of infrastructure investment, and promoting sound business practices within the industry and its client base. ACEC is committed to aggressive involvement in legislative and public sector decision-making, with a focus on protection of qualifications-based selection of engineering services, transportation and water resource investment, expanded project delivery options, and appropriate legal and liability systems affecting the industry. So with that, we thank and welcome ACEC to our programming, and we're happy to have you guys on board. As typical, at this point, we typically start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you could, stand, and we will go ahead and start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you for that. One thing with APWA that I'd like to inform everyone that's here today, we have exciting news from our APWA chapter. Our Insight magazine is going digital, so please be on the lookout for an email that will have a link to the Insight magazine. It is a new platform that we're trying out, and we hope you like it. If you have any comments or feedback, please reach out to me, and as well as our chair for our Insight magazine, Mrs. Lisa Rapp, and we can certainly try to improve upon it as we move forward through this process. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natasha Dominion for today's programming. Natasha?
Well, thanks, Trent. Appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Another virtual meeting, but I hope everybody's safe and happy. I would like to once again thank our gold, silver, and bronze sponsors for their commitment to us, especially during this time. While we're not physically together, I'd like to acknowledge our past presidents who have registered for this event. Thank you for your years of service to APWA, and thank you for being with us today. So a few housekeeping items. Everyone is on mute, except for the speakers. If you have questions for the speakers, please ask them to use the chat box over to your right-hand corner, I believe, and we'll get to your question. Also, if you're having difficulty viewing anything, please use the chat box as well. And we will be monitoring that chat box. Today, this webinar will be moderated by Jennifer Horn, and I will introduce the members. Jennifer Horn is a Policy Outreach Director for ACEC California. the Policy Outreach Director, Jennifer is the point of contact for all matters related to qualifications selection and acts as a resource to public agencies regarding the QBS process. Jennifer also staffs a number of APEC California committees prior to working for ACEC California. Jennifer worked the political field for 15 years. 8 of those years where she worked for an elected official at both the state and federal levels. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today. Chris Menju is a senior attorney at the LA office of Clark Hill LLP. Chris has been representing parties in the design and construction related disputes for 20 years, focusing on architects, engineers, contractors, owners, and insurers in all aspects of construction law, including contract and defect claims, professional law, risk management, contract analysis and advice, and mechanics, lien design, and professional law. Sorry about that, Chris. He has also represented numerous private and public entities in tort liability claims. Chris, thank you for joining us today. We also have Robert So, who has 30 years of highway project delivery experience, of which 22 years were spent in Caltrans. He is currently the Deputy District 7 Director for Program Project Management, which oversees the capital management, risk management, and consultant services unit, which procures and manages A&E contracts. Robert also held executive positions in District 8, right-of-way, and PPM. He recently completed an assignment as the acting deputy for District 7 construction. Robert is a registered civil engineer and certified PMP from PMI. He has a BS and MS in civil engineering from UC Irvine and an MBA from Pepperdine University. With that, Jennifer, take it away.
Great, thank you, Natasha. And thank you everyone for joining us on today's webinar. Before I get started with my presentation, I also just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who helped put today's webinar together. So thank you to those from APWA Southern California chapter, as well as ACEC California's Los Angeles chapter, for all of the time and effort that went into this webinar. Thank you so much. So as you heard, we have some great speakers ahead, including Natasha too. So let's jump right in. If we could go to the next slide, please, Tran. So qualifications based selection. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to start with an overview presentation of QBS. We're going to look at what a typical QBS process is and then how to administer the steps. We're also going to take a look at the value and the benefits of QBS and the benefits that it provides to agencies, design professionals, and the public. Next slide, please. Thank you. So QBS is a competitive procurement process that is used to hire design professional services based on qualification. Those professional services, as you can see in the list below, include engineering, land surveying, architectural. But what QBS does is it first evaluates firms based on their qualifications, their experience, their competence. It allows clients to evaluate, compare, and hire design professionals based on what distinguishes them from one another. So firms are competing on their ability to provide the best services to their clients. On the next slide, we're going to be going through what a typical QBS process might look like, but no matter what variation an agency might be using, the one thing that they will all have in common is at no point would there be a consideration for comparing the cost of services between the submittals. The quote you see above here is actually the first sentence of section 4526 of the California state statute, which requires local agencies and state agencies to procure professional services based on their competence and qualifications. Next slide, please. So this is going to be an overview of typical steps of what a QBS process will look like. I know Chris is going to be the next speaker from Clark Hill, and he's going to really discuss a lot further the federal and state statutes and the outlined requirements within that. So we're just going to do an overview, and I know Chris will talk a little bit more about that. So the typical steps of a QBS process: first, an agency identifies the project needs and the need for professional services. The next step would be the publishing of a request for qualifications, an RFQ, or a request for proposal, an RFP. Things that might be included within an RFQ or RFP could be the project background, the types of services being required, submittal requirements, and scoring or evaluation criteria. The next step would be the statement of qualifications are received, they're reviewed, and then the submittals are ranked. Some things that might be considered in what is submitted could be a relevant project experience, experience of key personnel that's assigned, resources, or past performance. The next step would be interviews. So interviews are conducted with a limited number of the highest ranked firms. Typically that's 3. As I said, Chris will kind of go into the state's process of their requirements, but for local agencies, there's flexibility. So a local agency could choose to interview 3 or 5. In some cases, local agencies may select without interviews, especially if the agency is familiar with the submitters. The interview process is another opportunity to further evaluate the qualifications of a firm. So then after interviews are done, the firms are ranked by the agency. Lastly would be negotiations, step 6. So it isn't until step 6 that cost becomes a part of the procurement process. So at this point, after the firms are ranked, negotiations would begin with the #1 highest ranked firm to try to settle on a fair and reasonable price. If the firm and agency are unable to do so, the agency can terminate those negotiations and then move on to try and negotiate with the second ranked firm and so forth. One variation that might be done, some agencies utilize what's called a sealed envelope process. So I'll give you a little bit of background of what that would look like. So if an agency is using a sealed envelope process, back in step 2, when an agency issues an RFP or an RFQ, at that point, the agency would request that cost and fees be submitted in a separate sealed envelope. That envelope doesn't come back into play again all the way until step 6. So you would request in step 2, go through the typical process that we had just reviewed, and then in step 6, when negotiations begin with the #1 highest ranked firm, at that point, the agency would open only the #1 highest ranked firm's envelope to try to settle on a fair and reasonable price. If again unable to, then the agency can end those negotiations and move on to the second ranked firm, in which case the agency would then open the second ranked firm's envelope. Once an agreement is done between an agency and a firm, any unopened cost proposals should be returned to the unselected firms in order to provide confidence that the selection was based solely on qualifications and that costs were not among the evaluation criteria officially or unofficially. So if an agency would like to do the sealed envelope process, I would also really recommend that these steps are very clearly outlined in the RFP or the RFQ to avoid any possible future confusion on what the agency's process is going to look like. If we could go to the next slide, please. So how is hiring design professional services different than hiring contractors? So contractors compete for a specified product. So innovation is rewarded when the means and the methods result in a lower cost. Whereas procuring professional services is unique. It's not a commodity. So factors like experience, innovation, qualifications come into play. So no 2 design professionals may demonstrate identical knowledge, experience, skills, or creativity. So you could have 2 different firms that may provide very different types of services, but within the same budget. So these services are very unique. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the cost of professional services, it actually relates to the time spent working on a project. The value is based on the demonstrated competence, experience, and background of an agency, also the reputation of the professionals that will be doing the work. The experience could include things like a firm's experience working with similar types of projects, codes, site conditions or standards. It could also include the staff resources and availability. The quality of professional services can impact construction documents, details, and costs, which we'll go further into in a future slide I have here. It can also affect the potential for problems and delays, public satisfaction, and safety and project risks. Next slide, please. So lastly here, we're going to take a look at the benefits of QBS and the value of QBS and how it helps to address community priorities, how the QBS process is cost effective, and also how it impacts the client trust and satisfaction. Next slide. So QBS addresses a myriad of community priorities. The most critical component of any project is the assurance of public safety, and the QBS process really prioritizes public safety. It safeguards the public interest. It allows client and design professionals to work together creatively to address the values and the priorities of the community. It can result in fewer construction delays, designed for long-term value. QBS procurement process helps to promote technological innovation. The procurement through QBS promotes life cycle savings through designs that minimize long-term maintenance costs. In using QBS, the client has the opportunity to fully define the project scope throughout the selection process for a really open dialogue opportunity. Next slide, please. So cost effectiveness. QBS is cost effective. It's important to consider all project related costs when you're trying to figure out how much a project is going to cost you. So this would include construction, maintenance, operation, sustainability, construction claims or delays. The design services are key to controlling construction lifecycle costs. The biggest potential for savings is at the earliest phase of a project before the project is on a fixed path. QBS has been shown to decrease construction cost growth, change orders, and schedule growth. And while the industry average, as you can see on the screen above, while the industry average on construction cost growth defined by the value of the cost of change orders as a percentage of the final construction cost, the industry average is a 10% construction cost increase, whereas QBS projects only have an increase of 3%. Those figures were from a 2009 study, which we're going to discuss a little bit further on the next slide. So if we could go to that. Thank you. So the 2009 study that I referenced is known as an analysis of the issues pertaining to qualifications-based selection. It was done by Pao Chinoski and Gordon Kingsley. And what the study showed is also that 93% of owners surveyed rated the success of final projects as high or very high. And the trust variable appeared to also receive consistently high scores from design team respondents. As you can see from the table below, design team respondents had a high response to feeling that negotiations were fair. There was a high level of trust and overall high positive experience. So this table and what we're seeing in front of us does show that there is a high level of trust. And although trust may not be exclusive to QBS procurement, it is valued highly by QBS focused teams and is considered a significant benefit. This high level of trust can also lead to lasting working relationships. Next slide, please. So resources. At ACEC California, our website, we have a link to what was known as the QBS Resource Center. So on that page, we have primers. There's an example on the screen in front of you. So we have primers on the QBS process that I outlined earlier, some of the benefits and the values that I went over briefly, as well as the QBS statutes. We also have a template available on our QBS Resource Center website. This template is of an RFQ and what that might look like when following the QBS process. So please feel free to go and check out our website. We have a lot of resources available, and I know my information will be also at the end. So please feel free to contact me if I can be of assistance at all or answer any questions. Next slide. Thank you. So this shows support for QBS. QBS is supported by both private sector and public sector organizations. What you see here is quotes from the American Society of Civil Engineers. There's a quote from the National Society of Professional Engineers, as well as a quote from APWA, all of which really just emphasize the importance of hiring the most qualified consultants. So that is the end of my presentation. Next up, we have Chris with Clark Hill.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm going to be speaking a bit about the governing statutes, both in federal law and specifically under California law, that have put into practice the benefits that Jennifer just described in selections through the QBS process. As far as the federal law is concerned, for federal projects and for state and local agencies receiving federal funding, there is a federal statute that was enacted in 1972. You can read it there. Basically, it just says that the cost is prohibited as a factor in the initial evaluation of selection of A&E professionals, but firms are ranked based on qualifications, experience, and other demonstrated competence based on the project itself, along with other relevant factors. This has been in place for 50 years for federal projects and for federal funding, and it's been consistently reaffirmed as the law for such projects. It was reaffirmed in '84 in the Competition and Contracting Act, which actually recognized that QBS was in fact a competitive process, even though the competition, as far as the finances and the cost, was a later part of the analysis. For federal funds, there is something called the simplified acquisition process, as well as micro purchases. So these are thresholds below which QBS is not going to be required in order to speed up, make it more efficient. For micro purchases, which is services and goods under, until recently it was under $10,000. And for simplified acquisition threshold of A&E services, until recently was under $250,000 for the services. Earlier this year, in response to the COVID crisis, the government increased those thresholds for the micro purchase was up to $20,000, and the SAT, or simplified acquisition threshold, was raised to $750,000. But those higher thresholds have to relate to goods services or A&E services that relate specifically to the emergency. And I imagine they'll be temporary and would probably be reduced. The process in the federal QBS selection process is not quite as mandated as California, so I won't go through that with regard to the federal law, but I will discuss it with regard to California law. California is one of a majority of states that have adopted QBS to procure A&E services for state and local agencies. It was the public policy since the 70s, but was enacted into law in Government Code 4525 through 4529 in the 90s. Like the federal law, and like Jennifer has explained, it mandates a competitive hiring process. California has some distinction between state and local agencies, which we'll discuss, which is of some interest to probably some of the attendees here, and that's largely based on the language that was selected by the legislature in passing the 4526, which is on the screen, which states, notwithstanding any other provision of law, selection by a state or local agency head for professional services, et cetera, shall be on the basis of demonstrated competence and on the professional qualifications necessary for satisfactory performance. The important provision in that is the fifth or sixth word of selection by a state or local agency. That will come back to play later. It's required of all state and local agencies. The selection is based on qualifications and not cost. The actual process is mandated in California statute, which state agencies have to abide by, but local agencies do not have to abide by, as Jennifer alluded to. Caltrans is a good, which Robert will talk about. Caltrans is a good example of the state agencies' very detailed selection process, submission process, and determination, and that's in Chapter 10 of the LAPM, which Robert will cover. Go to the next slide, please. So there is a specific QBS process for California or state agencies that must follow receiving federal funds and for public works. The criteria for the selection is set forth in 4527A, which sets forth the procedures, which requires the state agency to shall evaluate current statements of qualifications and performance data on file with the agency, together with those that may be submitted by other firms regarding the proposed project. At that time, consideration of cost is not authorized at this initial evaluation. Next slide, please. Once the state agency has to select at least 3 firms. It cannot be less than 3, and they can discuss an interview with the firms, and they can talk about anticipated concepts and the relative utility of alternative methods of approach for the services. And then based on those interviews, the state agency must select at least 3 firms to come back and then start negotiations. They basically have to, and Robert will specifically cover this, rank them in the order in which they are deemed the most highly qualified. The most highly qualified will be discussed a little bit further, but there must be at least 3 that are ranked in that way. The negotiations can then begin. The agency can call in the first ranked firm and begin negotiations and try and negotiate a fair price. That can either be through price determined at the negotiation or through a sealed bid, as Jennifer previously talked about. If the agency head cannot negotiate a satisfactory contract at a reasonable price, those negotiations are formally terminated, and the agency head then goes to the next qualified firm, and so on down the line, until they hopefully reach a negotiation with a satisfactory result. Next slide. So section 4528 talks about the selection process, and it previously noted it said the selection by a state agency shall use the QBS procedures that I just talked about in the last 2 slides. However, it says, the statute states that when the selection is by a local agency head, the agency may undertake the procedures described in subdivision A. Now, it has been sometimes argued or presented that this sentence means that local agencies are not bound by the QBS process. This has been rejected by courts because section 4528B basically says when the selection is by a local agency. And that refers to the previous slide in which it was discussed that the selection by a state and local agency must be by the QBS process. So all this means is that local agencies have some flexibility to choose the steps they follow. I think Jennifer referenced that they do not have to interview at least 3 firms. They don't have to take the same exact steps that the state agency has to, but nevertheless, cost component cannot be a factor until after the initial selection of the responding firm is selected. Interestingly, the QBS statutes initially didn't have local agencies involved, but in 1988 and 1989, there were some amendments to the statutes, which both added local agencies to the statute and in legislative council comments confirmed that the bill provides that the declaration also applies to a local agency head, and in addition made QBS what's called a state mandated procedure, essentially, that was required of the local agencies. And the legislative council opinions that have followed that have confirmed that local agencies are granted some flexibility in the minor and technical specifics of the procurement processes, as long as they adhere to the greater QBS structure. And by the way, there's also legislative council analyses and opinions that charter cities are also subject to the QBS process. Next slide, please. So in 2000, there was a ballot initiative known as Proposition 35, which was passed. And it requires a little bit of background because it's been related to the QBS statutes, and it's somewhat related and somewhat unrelated. Originally under the California Constitution, Article 7 established the civil servant program, and that was always interpreted to mean that professional design services, A&E services, could only be performed by civil servants. Over the years, as different needs arose, there were some government code statutes that were enacted that allowed for some exceptions to that requirement. For example, when the nature of the services were beyond the capability of the available civil servants, or when there was an inadequate staffing, or when it was required to achieve cost savings. And so agencies were limited in when they could outsource these services to outside A&E firms by these exceptions. In 2000, Proposition 35 was passed, as noted. That initiative added an amendment to the California Constitution, which actually removed those government code restrictions and basically said that, state agencies, local agencies, government, you are allowed to hire outside A&E firms to perform professional services. The Proposition 35 language uses the terms that it's supposed to support or is designed to support acquisition of services by a fair competitive selection process. And that was interpreted by some to mean that, well, competitive must mean, the price of the work. And there was a case filed by the Professional Engineers Union in California to challenge that declaration, to basically say QBS no longer applies in California, and the court disagreed. The court stated that QBS was in fact a competitive selection process, even though the competition aspect of the money occurred later in the process. The court stated that Proposition 35 impliedly repealed the government's code sections, which limited the ability of a state agency to, or a local agency to, outsource A&E work. And the court affirmatively stated that Proposition 35 was or QBS was a competitive process, and it confirmed that state agencies, this was a state agency case, not a local agency case, but confirmed that state agencies were required to use QBS in procuring A&E services. Next slide. Oh, and I think that's time for Robert.
Great, thank you so much, Chris, for reviewing the statutes. And as Chris mentioned, next up we have Robert from Caltrans District 7.
Oh, good afternoon. I'm glad to be here to talk to you folks. Jennifer and Chris did actually the great job of laying down the foundation of QBS. I guess my slides may be kind of redundant a little bit, but I'm here to give you a client perspective, Caltrans specifically, on the QBS process. We utilize QBS mainly for our A&E contracts, but as you know, we also procure a contractor as well. So those are through the bid process. But the world has been getting a little bit grayer with the new delivery methods like CMGC, where we are actually using QBS to bring on contractors at the design phase, and they're helping us with our plans, and we try to negotiate with them. And then if it's successful, 95% of the time, they go on to build the project as contractors. But if they're not successful in negotiation, then we go through the traditional bid process. So the QBS world is hitting contractors as well in Caltrans. Up on the slide, we typically have services for mostly design professional services. There's one thing in the Prop 35 Chris mentioned, and that led to the Article 22 of change in the Constitution, is the right-of-way services. In the Constitution amendment, the right-of-way services is mentioned, but due to conflicts with the streets and highway codes, right-of-way is not procured through the A&E process. It goes through a different process. But however, having said that, right-of-way engineering is gone through the A&E and QBS process. So Caltrans utilize QBS to procure A&E contracts for workload and specialty services. and that's where most of our QBS lies in. And then Chris talked a lot about the Prop 35, which led to the change in Article 22 of the California Constitution. And I want to talk to you about some other codes there. Next slide. So the foundation of all of the what we do is the Brooks Act, which Chris covered. And because a lot of our funding in the department has 90% more nexus with the federal funds, we are bound by law to follow the Brooks Act, as well as state statutes that Chris covered. But I want to point out a couple of terminology in the Brooks Act because that kind of lends itself to how we implement QBS in the selection process. So the first word that in the Brooks Act I want to point out to you, and I should have highlighted this in my slide, is the word negotiated, okay? And the other words I want to point out to you in the Brooks Act is fair and reasonable prices, okay? So I want to debunk the myth that QBS doesn't mean that, okay, well, you come in and you get selected and you can charge whatever you want. That's not what QBS is about. QBS is the selection process is cost blind. We don't compare cost in the selection process. Okay, and I think when Jennifer took you through her flow chart, at the end there is the ranking of the firms, and we use the blind envelope process, and we open the first ranked firm, and we look at the costs, and we look at the scope of services that was advertised, and we have a budget. And if the price is not reasonable or fair, then we are not able to successfully negotiate a contract with the firm. And we offer a fee and escalation, and which is not maybe compatible to the business strategy of the firms, then the firms walk away as well. So I just want to point out that it's got to be fair and reasonable, and we do conduct pre-audits and post-audits to make sure the consulting firms are charging other clients same prices they're charging us. So I think some entrepreneurial or ambitious people, they work in big companies. This thing is great, I can just charge whatever I want, and they start their own company, and they put in $1,000 an hour or whatever. It doesn't work that way. We're going to say that's not fair and reasonable. I'm sorry, we can't execute a contract with you. And so it's a discussion and negotiation. So that's some key terminology in the Brooks Act that I want people to understand. Next slide. So Chris did a great job going over all of the different regulations, federal, state, and these are some other ones that we're using in terms of how we implement the QBS in our processes. In addition to state and federal regulations, we also have Caltrans policies with incompatible activities and conflict of interest. So we make sure that people on the panel, that's part of the QBS selection process, they don't have a conflict with any of the firms that may potentially submit their SOQs to make sure it's a fair process and level playing field. And we also have implemented, at least in District 7, a policy to have panels that's diverse, gender, race, and so forth. And then also to make sure that not the same panel is on the similar contract when it's renewed in next time after a couple of years when it's expired. So we have taken great measure to make sure that not only we follow the laws, but also to try and have a fair and even playing field for all the consultants, big and small. We've reached out to ACEC to vet through any process changes, as well as the Small Business Council. to make sure that the way that we're conducting our evaluations and the type of contract we procure is at least agreeable to the A&E community, both big and small. Okay, next. I want to focus, next slide. I want to focus on one particular code of regulations, which is the 21 CCR 1520. Again, there are some things in here, that drives our process. So we've already talked about, submitting the statement of qualification, and it's explicitly said here as well. And then there's a portion called performance data. At the end of each A&E contract, we do a evaluation of the consultant, and we keep records. And we can use those records in the future procurement, but it's kind of very difficult in the sense that sometimes because you have individuals working in a firm, but then in the future, those individuals may be in another firm, and people move around in our industry. And so it's not strictly, based on firm qualification, but as well as the performance of the individuals who perform the contract. Okay, the other terminology I want to focus in on is called discussions. And we talked about no less than 3 firms. But the way that our legal attorneys have interpreted discussion way back when they first set up the process is interviews. And that's why you see in our process, we have interviews, because in the code of regulation, it says discussions. We have to talk to you. So they kind of interpret that as discussion. Now, in other states that we've surveyed, for instance, I think New York, they don't necessarily have interviews. SOQs get submitted, and there's a panel just like we do, but they don't call people for interviews. What they do is they look through the SOQs and they make a phone call, and they get clarification of the SOQ, and they're not necessarily invited to an interview unless it's a mega project, and in which case they do something similar to us. And then the last part of this statement, regulation says in order of preference, right? So that is the ranking. And then the other really important thing, at least for Caltrans, on how our legal department interpret this, is the most highly qualified, okay? And that's that one word there, most highly qualified, has impacted the way that we let out A&E contracts. Because when I first started doing A&E contracts 20-some odd years ago, we had multiple A&E consultants in the same geographic area providing similar or same A&E services. And we try to be fair and give a task order to each one whenever work came up or whoever is available, and we manage it that way. And we, in addition to the districts having that, the headquarters had a master contract. So in case the districts ran out of money or the contract expired and we were going through a procurement process and we didn't have an A&E contract while we were going through the process, headquarters contract was kicked in as a master contract so that we would not be left out of not using consultant. Somewhere along the way, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, our attorney said, well, most highly qualified meant one. So in other words, you cannot have more than one consultant providing the scope of services in a particular geographic area. Okay, so that word has impacted our business practice greatly, because it would have been, at least from a business standpoint of view, nice to have a list of available consultants rather than having just one available to rely on. Okay, so that's the regulations, and then next slide. And this is pretty much a process inconsistent with what Jennifer had laid out. And you go through an advertisement and then the submittal of the SOQ evaluation and then interviews and negotiation. And we're targeting 75 days in Caltrans to do that. One thing that, again, as best practice and trying to have a fair and level playing field for all consultants is to have this thing we have in the department called a look-ahead report. Okay, so this is prior to the advertisement. And we do this because we don't want to have consultants, know about contract before the advertisement because, they have talked to someone in the department or whatnot. So we have this look-ahead report. As soon as we make a decision that we're going to have a contract, and it takes some time for us to prepare the paperwork, go through headquarters DPAC, write out the scope and do all of those things before it gets advertised. But in the meantime, we want the A&E community to know about it, and not because they heard it through somebody in the department or whatnot, but we want everybody to know as soon as that we have an idea, a general idea where the service is going to be, the location is. So we have implemented this look-ahead report. And I think Natasha mentioned I spent first 8 years in the consulting world. So when I first started right out of school, then some of the marketing folks in our company, they always say they subscribe to a service and to find out what contracts are coming up before the advertisement. And that always amazes me because somehow these services knew what contract was coming out before even I knew about it. I mean, when I started to work in Caltrans, I don't know if they could read my mind or whatnot, but so I think the look-ahead report does away with that. And sorry for all those businesses who are still providing that kind of services, but we want to let you know as soon as we know about this. So we're trying to be transparent and fair in the process. Okay, so that's pretty much the process. I want to get into a little bit more detail on how the client, at least from Caltrans part, we look at each of these things. So the first part is the initial evaluation, which is the SOQ evaluation. And this is the criteria that the panel members look at, and you can see their consultant, contract manager availability, the composition, education, etc. There are some weights to it, and then we provide a suggesting scoring system to the panel members as guidance. So the next slide, please. And okay, next. Okay, so this is what the scoring system looks like in terms of the panel members evaluating SOQ. So we have somewhat of a consistency and objectivity in terms of being able to evaluate the consultant. Okay, so then after they get through that, we have a short list of at least 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, depending on how clustered they were. If we had 4 of them scored in the 90s, then we will invite 4 of them or 5, but the rest of them is in the 70s, then there's a gap. So the selection committee looks at, if there's a gap, then we will invite the top firms, but at least 3, like Chris and Jennifer mentioned before. Okay, then once we get the top 3 or sometime more, we invite them to the interview. Next slide. And in the interview, we have 2 sections, and within the first section, we have a part A and part B. Part A is like a presentation, and part B is the technical questions being asked. And we have a second section called the initial evaluation portion, and that's a carryover of your SOQ scores from the initial evaluation. The reason we did that, and I work with DPAC, again with John Neary, probably some of you are familiar with John. We try to make it so that the actual SOQs have some weight in the entire process. because previously Caltrans process was that you shortlist, and then the firm that got into the interview, they were starting off at scratch, blank. So it could be that the top ranked firm who scored in the 90s, and then the rest of them scored in the 80s or so, the second and third, they will come to the interview. But for some reason, the one that was the most qualified on paper on the SOQ, when they came to the interview, they didn't be able to answer the question for some reason. Okay, so I think to make the process a little bit more fair, and that we wanted to have some weight in terms of the initial evaluation, which is the actual submittal of the qualifications, resumes and so forth, be part of the final selection process. So that's why we have a section 2 there, and it's given some weight. But still, at this point, throughout the years, most of the firms that rank in the top 3, it's like splitting hairs. Every single one can do the firm, and they're pretty much equally qualified, but the presentation, the answering question is almost like a tiebreaker. So this does help a little bit to at least make sure that we are getting the most qualified firm in the process. Okay, next slide. Again, same thing with the initial evaluation. We do provide some guidance to the panel for the interview portion, and this is published, and everyone can, it's not anything secret. Everything we do in Caltrans, we're totally transparent, and there's nothing that we keep secret in terms of the process. So you can look at the criteria and how we do things. And the other thing that we've done for a long time, even ever since I started, is we've always used the average rank process. So in other words, we don't use average scores, okay? Because if you use average scores, then there could be one panel member have a disparate scoring than the other, and it could drag down a firm from a very high ranking to a low ranking. But if you use average ranking, then it's normalized. So this way, each panel member has their rank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then another panel have a rank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth, etc. And it's evenly normalized. But if you have average scores, then you could have one panel member have 90s, 80s, and one firm at 30, and then another panel member have all 90s, and another panel member have all 70s. And when you average them out, then the math may not lend itself to maybe having the best process. So average rank is the fair and better process to do. I think that's probably the end of my slide, so I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Robert, for that information. And our last presenter before we begin the question and answer portion of the webinar is Natasha from Ghirardelli & Associates.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I was asked to put it from a perspective of getting ready for the QBS, getting ready for the interview, or when the RFP comes out, and what the process we kind of go through, as a firm trying to get ready for this. So next slide. One thing that we're, next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to cover over hiring qualified staff for projects and upcoming opportunities, finding the projects and opportunities, positioning, the go, no-go process, the RFQ, the RFP, and the proposal. Next slide. So hiring quality staff. One of the things that we do, and all our firms I'm sure we do, is making investments in our project managers, our resident engineers and inspectors, and our supporting staff. It's really important because we want to bring quality staff with the experience to our clients. The other thing is, of course, as a company, as a firm, as we all do, is trying to keep our staff. The benefits, the salaries, vacation, safety, the education, the training, and keeping them busy. They want to stay busy. So we're thinking about this all the time. Also, one of the things is, as a small business, but at any business, is that, you know, we have to properly adhere to the prevailing wage laws. We have no control over that. Every year they put up the prevailing wage, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but just some stats a little bit from 2015 to 2020. The increase went from 205, and now it's at about 245 for Southern California. And in Northern California, it started at 175, and now it's up to 345 in increases for the hourly wage. And the other thing is, of course, is managing our professional staff on projects, making sure we're keeping our clients happy, and, you know, solving problems, you know, if they come up, and making sure we have those right staff in place. Next slide. Funding projects. Well, our companies, we invest in a lot in research, invest in going to meetings, now webinars, a lot more webinars that we're doing, luncheons, breakfasts. We try to network with people, building relationships, clients, teaming partners. That all takes time to develop, and looking for projects. Caltrans puts their 12-month look ahead, which is great, because then, you know, we can start looking at projected information. So it's good. It's glad to see those come out, because like I said, we look for 1 to 2 years out, trying to get ready for the project, and if we have the right staff, where are our staff at this time. Then we keep track of that project, you know, like as they put out information for it from these meetings and everything, then we keep track of it, trying to see where it is in design, where is it in, you know, what's going to be the length of the construction, you know, different things like that. And then the other thing is learning and understanding what the client and project needs are through this whole process. You know, when you go listen to them, what are their needs, understanding what those needs are. So we're doing this understanding and learning. And then, of course, then we go back to what we call our go, no go, and updates as information is found. And I'll explain the go, no later on a little bit more. Next slide. Positioning. Positioning means that we targeted a project, or we've targeted maybe probably 20 projects, who knows. So what we're doing is we're finding relative events related to those projects to update ourselves, to understand what's going on. Getting together with potential teaming partners, our competition. You know, while we compete with each other, we still work with each other. We're still one community, no matter what. And then, you know, looking for specialty firms, looking for those that have that special niche. And then the other big important thing is visiting with our potential clients, because sometimes, you know, what's written as a project description might not really say, or we get questions. We have questions after we read certain things. And so meeting with the client and staff members, trying to understand their perspective, also helps us give a really hands-on understanding. And then, of course, now we're looking for the right qualified person in team. That could be recruiting. It could be, you know, where's our staff at, you know, and who do we have for this? Are they going to be available? So we're looking at all this while we're looking at the projects and positioning the firm to see whether or not we can go after this. Next slide. The RFQ, RFP process. Now that the RFQ, we've positions, we've studies, we've learned. First thing we have to do as a firm, and this includes our project managers, our business development people, and our marketing people, to review the RFQ, what the requirements are, what we know based upon the positioning, and what we understand about the project, looking at our competition, the relationships, our go, no-go wins, win odds, our teaming partners, and then we are, of course, looking at our staffing, our availability. We put an org chart together, what the needed qualifications are based upon that. And then, of course, the other big thing is for us is the proposal cost versus potential fees. So next slide. So the proposal, this is a condensed version. This this whole PowerPoint is very condensed, and I'm just trying to make it just as simple as possible. But we review the costs. Let's say, for instance, we start with a 10% fee, let's say as an example, and it's going to cost us $50,000 for a $1 million contract. Right then and there, we lose $5,000. We're down to 5% in profit. So what can we do? How can we do it? So, you know, all those costs include our marketing time, our technical staff time. We're taking our billable people, our PMs and our REs off billable projects, or they're working on their own for us, giving us their time back, you know, to help us with these proposals in writing these technical pieces, because there are technical guys. They're the ones with the experience. You know, again, we have to take in what the prevailing wage is going to be, the increases are going to be coming up, printing costs if there's printing that's involved. If not, electronic is great. And then also the interview prep materials and time for interview for our professional staff to go out for that. Next slide. So potential teaming partners, what their qualifications are, what the past history has been. Have they had a good reputation with the agency on other projects, what the relationship is. And then we make a final decision on the go, no go. And basically from that point at the go, no, we just evaluate, you know, what our clients are looking for. Do we have the qualified staff? You know, and if we have all that and we look pretty good, then we start putting together our matrix and all the things that we need, due dates, sub outreach, getting ready, and putting deadlines on. Next slide. One of the things that comes up a lot when we get the RFQ, RFP is questions. Questions, I was reading and listening to some other presentations, and there was one gal that was saying that in one RFQ, RFP, there was 122 different questions that came out in just one that, because they just had so many questions. So one of the things that came up in general form, this is just general, talking with staff and other people, is like on the things when it comes to forms. Which forms do you agencies want in the proposal? Sometimes it's not clearly defined. You know, it doesn't say, well, do you want it part of the proposal or don't you? Including all supporting documentation. Sometimes there's a lot of stuff that goes out that doesn't have all the submitting, doesn't have the forms. And so we have to ask for the form. Can you go ahead and repeat that? Or can you please send it to us, excuse me. And then that's another addendum that they have to send that. So that's just more work. Requesting of financials. Typically in an RFP and RFQ, we're not rated on our financials. And so there's no really markdown and everything. And when you ask for that, I mean, sometimes we could have 15 subs and then we don't have an interview, all that paperwork, getting everybody together. It's a lot of time for us and it costs more money. So it helps us if we don't have to have that, you know. And so what we're suggesting is to maybe request it at the time of interview. So this way, it's more condensed. We spend more time on the interview and doing that and not on wasted paperwork or extra paper. Next slide. The other thing is when you have federally funded projects, sometimes the RFPs notes that your guys are using federal funds, but yet there's no DBE percentage. And sometimes these are on the on-calls. So what we suggest, because we're going to have a DBE percentage no matter what on those federal, they're going to have us have that. And we're going to need a DBE. But at the time, we don't know what the projects is going to be. So we need to add our DBEs and have that ability to add that DBE percentage to help us. You know, so when we don't have that percentage, so you have to give us the ability to add that down the line if it's for a specific project. Basically, what I'm just trying to say is just in conclusion, you know, a less precise RFP creates more questions. You know, maybe what you want to do is maybe have somebody from a different area in your agency review it. Maybe a communications person who communicates and wants to be clear about certain things, because we do get, there's a lot of questions. You know, you got the 20 pages. What does that mean? You know, so those are the different things. So just try to do your best. I know it's a lot of work. You guys have limited people, limited staff, and we just really, you know, just appreciate it and want to try to help your staff not spend as much time answering all those questions. So, because it takes a lot to answer those questions. And when there's more questions and your staff's having to answer them, then, you're spending more time on it. And next slide. Now, this is one of the things that ACEC wanted me to talk about. I think it's a sensitive thing, but this is in general, and it's just based upon an industry input, why we want QBS to be part of the process. When you put cost up front in the very beginning, and you're just looking for a low bid, then it's really not qualification based anymore. It's not following what Caltrans does and what everything. So all we're just saying that qualification based is really important to us, and cost shouldn't be part of that first part. The other thing is, when we learn or hear that it might be qualification based, then it will happen that maybe we'll reevaluate and whether or not we're going to go and propose. So that means that you could possibly get less proposals. The other potential that we've seen, or I've seen sometimes that happens, is that you might get a lowball cost, and then you might eventually get some change orders, and you don't want to put yourself over budget. It's just a possibility, when people lowball or when firms lowball, trying to get, because it's based upon cost. You want quality again. Next slide. And then I just want to let you know, proposals are expensive, especially to small businesses. They are to big businesses too, but for us, putting a proposal together, we have to look at our overheads, and everything. And it is costly. Just remember that it's very costly when you ask for so many extra things that maybe can be handled in an interview. And we just want to say, as a consultant industry, the two-step process that we've been talking about, the QBS, is qualifications based first, and then look at our costs, because our costs are audited. They're supposed to be reasonably priced. We get our stuff audited all the time. And then this two-step process, the assumptions that are made in the RFP, there might be different assumptions made in the RFP. So then you're not really comparing apples to apples, when it comes to the cost, until after you look at your qualified people. And then you can get into negotiations. You get to sit down and talk about your scope, what you intended in it, and why it might be more money. And then you guys can we can come up with a better result for everything. And like I said, these are just general ideas and terms, just to say that it's important for us as we put proposals together, and we do put a lot of effort. I know our firm does. We put a lot of effort to try to bring the quality people to you folks. And next slide, I think that's it. Yes, that is it for me. Hopefully there's no questions.
Thank you, Natasha, for that insight. As I mentioned, now we'll go ahead and transition into the question and answer portion. There might be some questions coming in, so I know those are getting monitored, but we're just going to go ahead and start with some common or frequently asked questions of our panelists. Some are directed at certain panelists, but any of our panelists, please feel free to chime in. So this first question is for Robert. For those consultants that do not get selected, how do you handle the debriefs?
Okay, that's the most, I guess, part that I don't like, is because the consultants are so equally qualified. Everybody feels like they're the best qualified, but there's only one contract. At the end of the day, we can only be awarded to one. And so most consultants do ask for debriefing. Our policy is that we wait until the contract is executed before we do a debrief. And I think the kind of myth or whatnot is, things like the consultant may have on their mind is, should we have been color coded with what we wear? Did my tie look good? Or, did I, was eloquent speaking? Things like that. And, that's not really weighs in on how the selection committee evaluates. and I try to tell them, well, on this question, you didn't really answer the question. And so I try to give helpful tips. A lot of it in the SOQ portion, there's people that didn't make it to the actual interview. A lot of it has to do with the people, the team they put together and who their subs were and so forth. And the only thing I tell them is you need to have a team that's well qualified to at least pass through the SOQ stage. And so what I usually suggest to them is, spend your time, marketing time, rather than trying to meet with the district director or the governor or whoever. Spend your time, marketing time, hiring well-qualified personnel. And you wouldn't have any issues with getting selected to the next phase for the interview. That's option one. Option two is you can partner with firms that fill the qualification gap. And so then the third option is just buy a firm that's well qualified. Then you can get on to the next phase of the process. So usually that's the way that I've done debriefing is if they don't make it to the interview, I talk about their qualification. And then when they do make it to the interview and they don't get selected, the conversation is revolving more around particular answers or particular presentation material they presented. So that's how we handle debriefing.
Thank you. This next question is really question open for all the speakers. So I'll just ask it and then run through the list of speakers and see if you have any thoughts you might want to add. But the next question is, what are the pitfalls or risks if an agency decides not to use QBS? And so I'll just go ahead and start with my screen, what I see here. So I've got Natasha on the left. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, one thing is if there is a problem and there's firms that want to protest or something like that, we probably won't go that route because it's just not the best route for us. So that's some of the pitfalls. If you do, kind of do that, and sometimes it's just not the best way to go about trying to, work it through.
And Robert, do you have anything, thoughts on that question?
So not using QBS is not an option for us as a government agency. The federal funds require it. But having said that, let's say if I was, running my own private firm or something, I think the danger is that you're at risk in terms of not having qualified individual to perform the service, and you may save money upfront, but in the long run, it may cost you much more than the savings that you have. So I would say that in terms of a non-governmental perspective, but from a governmental perspective, we are required by law to use QBS.
Thank you, Robert. And Chris, do you have any thoughts about some pitfalls or risks?
Yeah, just and following up on Robert's comment, Caltrans, it's clear they're using QBS. It's also clear that local agencies and charter cities have to also employ QBS. And as a consultant, it'll be clear to you if they're not using QBS, if they ask for cost or make cost a part of the consideration. So if that's not being followed, that's going to be immediately obvious, and that may have some ramifications down the road as far as if somebody protests the award and it's based on cost. There's a lot of political ramifications. There's legal ramifications to be considered. On the other hand, ideally, the agency, or hopefully the agency, will have some sort of robust, standards as far as conflict of interest. Because even if cost is not being considered, you still need to worry about, or at least be aware of. You don't want to have any conflicts of interest. You don't want to have political contributions. You don't want to have gifts. You don't want to have favors. I think Caltrans has a pretty robust protest, set of standards, and that they follow them, and they're very transparent. And that needs to be made clear for all agencies that they if they don't have such a policy, they probably should have one, or at least make it known to the people doing the reviewing that it has to be based on qualifications and competence, and it can't be based at all on favoritism or any of those aspects.
Yeah, and I want to just touch on what Chris said about local agencies. I've seen in my career at least 2 times that local agency where there were some federal funds involved and they didn't follow the QBS process, and they had to end up paying back those federal funds because they didn't follow the QBS process. So it's really a danger for local agencies whenever federal funds is involved not to follow the QBS process, because Caltrans, we administer federal aid through our local assistance branch, and we've seen at least a couple of those times.
Thank you for that insight. The next question is directed to Natasha. As a consultant, how do you determine if a project is worth going after?
Well, first of all, it has to do if we have the right staff for the project. We got to look at the RFQ, what they're asking for. Do we have the right staff? Also, we have to look at when their availability is going to be happening, you know, do we have to recruit? How much more time do we have to recruit for that? The other thing is what's the construction schedule look like? You know, is there a possibility that's going to move? Right now with the COVID, you know, some of those construction projects, you know, had little start time delays. So then, you know, you have to, you know, look at that now as part of it. So, and it's just really, and then look at, well, let's see how much we have to, what does the RFQ look like? What are the requirements look like? How much staff are we going to have to put? Does our marketing staff have enough time? Is this a key client that we want to work with, like Caltrans? You know, is this something we want to keep on going, or we want to be a new client of Caltrans, or we want to be, you know, we want to work with that particular agency? So that's the other part that takes place.
Thank you for that insight. The next question is for Robert. By firms not submitting for an advertisement, does that make any difference for future procurement opportunities?
No, absolutely not. We don't track whether, you know, which firm submitted or which firm doesn't submit it. So there is no scoring criteria that looks at, you know, if the firms submitted in the past or whatnot. It's purely based on qualification, and we only look at the individuals presented in your SOQ. And I want to debunk maybe a myth that's out there. You know, we're not looking at qualification of the firms, necessarily. We're looking at the qualifications of the individuals proposed on the particular SOQ. So within the firm, you may have different individual, and if you put forth in your A team, they may have a better chance of being selected than your C team or whatnot. So as far as firms not submitting, that makes no difference to us. So we don't keep track, you know, we don't have a secret blacklist or something like that, you know, so that's not any factor at all.
Thank you, Robert. And then the last question or common question is actually a question I get often, which is how is QBS implemented when an agency has an established on-call list? And so if the agency is contracting with multiple firms for as-needed services, then after the agency has selected a firm who in their judgment is best fit for the task, the agency should then attempt to negotiate a fair and reasonable price with only that firm. And then if those negotiations are unsuccessful, the agency can terminate those negotiations and move on to negotiate with the second-ranked firm and so forth. And with that, I will turn it back over to Tran. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Robert and Chris and Natasha, for the great presentation. We do have a few questions from the audience, and I thank the audience for waiting till this time to get it answered. A real quick one, Robert, this is for you, is that one of our members wanted to ask if Caltrans is willing to share the A&E consultant evaluation form, or is that something that's available online for them to download? If not, can it be shared?
You mean the ones that's like a blank template, or the ones that has been already? Yeah, it's available through the headquarters DPAC website. So everything that we have in Caltrans is available publicly.
Okay. Perfect. The next question is from another member saying, are there requirements to base a consultant selection on purely the interview? And then is there no combination allowed for proposal or SOQ score plus the interview score? And I think that's to Robert.
Yeah, and that's what I covered in my presentation. When I first started, that's the way the selection process went. We followed the SOQ evaluation, the top 3, or sometimes the cluster that's very close. We bring them to the interviews. And then at that time, it was like everybody had a blank slate. It didn't matter whether the first 2 was in the 90s and then the third firm was in the 70s, because we just had to shortlist the 3. So the third firm was probably not qualified, but they got in there because of the top 3 criteria. And then when they came to the interview, somehow the third firm, might have done their homework better or researched the right question or whatnot. And then the first 1 or 2 don't do well, and then the third one ends up, being the best at the interview and getting the contract. But the sad thing was they weren't the best qualified firm necessarily. They just did very well at the interview. So I think 5-7 years ago, I worked with John Neary, and we said we got to fix this, and we have to make sure that the actual qualification of the individuals itself is part of the overall final selection process. So that's why now at least for Caltrans, we consider both the SOQ scoring as well as the final interview score together in making the final selection.
Thank you. All right. The next question is on a traditional project delivery, design, then bid, then build. We are seeing increased local agency city attorney direction that consultants are precluded from proposing as they were involved in the prior phase of the project, saying it gives a consultant an unfair advantage. For example, moving from project report and environmental to final design. Is that valid? Is that still going on?
Well, at least for Caltrans, we've started to do multi-phase project-specific contracts where we have the option of using the same consultant. Okay, so we let out a contract saying that we need to start off at the P&ED phase, and then if they perform well, then we can continue with the consultant to the PSNE phase. Before, I think, they went after the P&ED, and then now we went out for an advertisement for the PSNE, and then obviously if they did the P&ED, they have a better advantage. But I think the approach the department is taking with the multi-phase project specific addresses that issue, that we're trying to procure services throughout all the phases, including design support in construction, not the actual construction administration, but design support in construction as well as the PSNE phase.
All right. You seem like a popular guy today in the Q&A, so I hope you have some water. Many agencies, typically small cities and special districts, contend they use QBS, but a review of their publicly available records show typically they always rank the lowest bidder #1, and they award the project to them. How do you counter this type of behavior? And I guess since we don't have any local agencies and the understanding that Caltrans uses QBS and is required to use QBS, what's your thought? I think this is more towards Chris. Have you seen this in the legal side of things?
Yeah, and whether a official formal challenge, like Natasha mentioned, is going to be made is a business political decision with a lot of different aspects to it. But if if it turns out that the lowest bidder, although, you know, as Jennifer pointed out, if there are sealed bids, other bidders aren't really going to know what the other bids are. If price is being used as a consideration, I have seen a case where the firms were ranked all, you know, sort of the scores that Robert was describing. They were given these ranked scores and they were all equal, but there was a cost column and they went with the lowest bidder. And, you know, it was up to the decision had to be made by the bidder. Do I want to challenge this? Do I want to put myself on some sort of a list? So it does happen. And it's up to, you know, no one will know about it unless the unsuccessful bidder says something about it. But there is a risk that if someone were to go to court and seek remedy for that, there's certain penalties. And as Robert mentioned, you know, there could be a financial penalty to the local agency, which could be, you know, quite expensive and have far-reaching ramifications. So it's probably better to, you know, the federal CFR regulations regarding the award ask agencies to avoid even the appearance of impropriety or conflict, or evaluating things that shouldn't be evaluated. So I think it's just incumbent on the local agencies to do that.
Got it.
And Tran, if I can add to that, I can say that part of my role at ACEC California is acting as a resource to agencies as well, and to promote QBS education. And I know sometimes there's staff changes and things like that. I know some agencies that, you know, had thought they were doing QBS properly, and then there was maybe one little thing within the RFP that made it not a proper QBS process. And so I kind of assist with that as well. So at ACEC California, we also just want to make sure that it's known that we're a resource and we're here if there is anyone that has any questions about a QBS process, and we're happy to help. And I work with agencies often on that. So again, my contact information is there, so anyone can feel free to reach out to me if I can be of assistance.
Yeah, and I just want to comment on it. That's why we're trying to do this education, to know that it's out there. That's why we have Chris. That's why we're doing this, to educate folks, hopefully for them to understand, you know, from us professionals that, you know, it should be quality based and why it's quality based and why it's important. But like Chris was saying, there are legal ramifications, but it's whether or not you choose to go that route or not, because it's hard. So we're hoping that this education might help everybody and hopefully get those agencies to really take part of the QBS process.
Yeah, and my experience is the bigger agencies, cities, counties, they understand this very well. It's this smaller ones that, you know, they only work on federal aid projects once in a while or whatnot. And, you know, for those smaller cities, cost is a big consideration because they have smaller budgets, so their dollar has to reach far. But oftentimes I see that it's not being aware of the rules and regulations requiring QBS is the pitfall for them. For example, you know, they may say, okay, well, I got some grant, a federal grant for the construction piece of it, the capital dollars, right? The paying for the concrete rebar and stuff. But the design services is paid through, you know, city funds or some non-federal funds or whatnot. But that's not the way that the federal process, I think, looks at it. Is I think there's a nexus from beginning to the end, and you have to use QBS in order to participate in the federal aid program. So things like that. I just think just the more education, like Natasha said, helps to smaller agencies.
Right. So we are running a little bit over, and we're going to ask our panelists to hopefully stay for a little bit longer to answer these last few questions. I think it's important. So we're going to just hang out a little bit longer. So the one question that comes out is, many times agencies will ask whether we can accept their contract terms. And if we make suggestions to change the terms or scoring is reduced, their scoring is reduced. There are some firms that will accept anything, and so at times some agencies or some firms are forced to accept what would be termed unfair contractual terms if they want to compete. Any suggestions for what can be done about this specifically? And I guess that would be, this discussion would be probably towards Robert and Jennifer, if you've seen that.
Yeah, so at least on Caltrans part, we have regular dialogue and outreach to industry, such as ACEC, Small Business Council, whatnot. When there is issues out there, when new language or terms and agreements, ACEC brings that up to our headquarters meeting. And we also have professional liaison meetings in the districts as well. And we discuss those, and we try to address the concerns of the consulting community and try to have a good partnership with them. So that's how we address things. But in general, if the contract is already advertised, there's nothing we can do to change that terms to favor one consultant, business practices.
I guess the question was more towards, if the agency like Caltrans, would you change the contract terms, or if they suggested a new contract terms because it doesn't work with them for some reason, they give you a good reason why it doesn't work for the current consultant or the selected consultant, is there something that is reduced?
No, we don't generally change the contract term because when we advertise it, I think it's also known what the terms are, it's your general clauses and things. And I think it would be unfair to other consultants who necessarily didn't go for the contract because of the terms and condition was a certain way. And then if you change it after a consultant get it, then I think it wouldn't be fair. So.
Okay. Another question is geared towards Caltrans and Robert, mainly is from the client's perspective when reviewing kind of personnel resumes, how important is it for it to contain professional summaries, bios, and helping you determine an individual's qualifications? And to follow up with that, what criteria do you use to determine performance data?
Okay, so the submittal requires the standard forms. There's I forgot what the form number was, but it's been a while. But yes, you have to list your individuals on your team members and their experiences, their educations, and so forth. And I think I mentioned earlier, the evaluation is not about what a particular firm did in the past. It's more about the individual qualifications. So I'm hoping Bechtel is not on the call, but if Bechtel comes to the interview and say, we built the Hoover Dam, we have a great team. I said, well, no, I mean, which team members there was involved in building the Hoover Dam, right? So I just gotta put it out there. People in our industry, they move around all the time. So you could have a great team who did a great scope of services for you in one contract, but if all those people have left and they go to another firm who didn't do well in the selection process, but now they're all over there, then it's really each individual that we look at in the resumes and then the SOQs as part of the selection process, and then the interviews will be almost like a tiebreaker, like I said.
Right. And then we'll end with this. The quote, fair and reasonable is how it's phrased. Cost negotiation is in the last step, but the owner has the option to go with either the second or third place firm. Isn't that a negotiation advantage for the owner? Or vice versa, the selected team might propose less qualified personnel to meet the owner's budgetary constraints. So are you really receiving the best qualified firm is the question.
So I guess that I'm the only owner on the panel. So the way that we look at it is not necessarily, all we're looking to is make sure that whatever price is being proposed is consistent with what the firm is charging other clients, and it's within the norm of what we have done with other contracts. We're not looking to, have the lowest price when we do start off negotiation with the first ranked firm. We're just checking to make sure that it's reasonable and fair. And so and now even the fee, I believe we're in the practice of putting that in the advertisement. We don't even surprise the firms at the end saying, well, this is your fee. And then they say, no, that's not going to work for us. And they walk away. We're moving towards advertising the fee so they know upfront to make the go or no-go decision. And this way they don't have to spend the dollars if the fee structure is not the profit, is not reasonable to them. As far as, a lot of our contracts currently is on-call. So it's really not particularly a price that we're negotiating at the end of the process. We're looking at the individual rates and other direct costs and the fee and profit and those things. In those instances where we have project-specific ones, what we do is normally we have an estimate of hours from our internal staff, how much it would take our internal staff to do the project and the task. And when we sit down with the firms, we're not looking at price, we're looking at the hours. And we're saying, okay, is that reasonable amount of hours compared to if we would have done it, okay? And at the end of the day, okay, we agree upon the hours, and then we figure out what the dollar is gonna be. And the only thing we check for is it within our budgetary authority or within our programmed amount for the project? If it is, then okay, then we move forward with it. But if it's not, then we say, well, we can't afford this because we don't have the budgetary authority to move on with this. So we're not necessarily taking their costs as part of the selection, even at the negotiation phase. All we're looking for is the fair and reasonableness of their estimate.
Great. So really, thank you for your guys' time. I know we're quite a bit over. For those that are still sticking with us, thank you for your time as well. We have this recorded. We will be pushing it out on our social media sites, which is LinkedIn, as well as YouTube. And so, and our APWA website, and we'll share that with ACEC, as I'm sure they will want to do that as well. But this pretty much wraps up our webinar for today. I thank all the panelists and the moderator for taking the time to educate us on QBS. And our next meeting will be for APWA, that is, will be August 27th. It'll be on Caltransit's District 7 local distance assistance and City of Lancaster to discuss rail programming funding opportunities. So we look forward to seeing you on August 27th. With that, we wish you well and be safe and take care. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.